Death has a way of stripping away every pretense a person carries and revealing exactly what lives inside the human heart. And many believers, without ever realizing it, are committing acts at funerals that grieve the Spirit of God. Not every tear shed at a graveside is holy. Not every custom passed down through a family honors the Lord. What I am about to show you today can change the way you walk through every funeral for the rest of your life, because there are practices that, if you carry them out, can wound your faith, dishonor the one who has died, and open spiritual doors you never intended to open. Ecclesiastes 7:2 tells us it is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of everyone, and the living should take this to heart. That means a funeral is never simply a ceremony to be endured. It is sacred ground, and sacred ground demands the same discernment you would carry into any other spiritual place. We are not called as believers to suppress our grief or act as though death does not wound us, but we are called to grieve differently than those who carry no hope. What you do in that room, what you allow into that moment, and what you take part in out of tradition or pressure from family can shape your spirit far more deeply than you realize. Today, we are going to talk about 7 dangerous things Christians do at funerals, things Scripture warns us never to do. 1. Never grieve as those who have no hope. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 says that we are not to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that we do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. I think of families I have watched stand beside a casket, undone by a sorrow that has no floor beneath it and no light above it. That is not sadness, that is despair, and despair has no place in a heart that belongs to Christ. This does not mean your tears are forbidden. Jesus himself wept at the tomb of Lazarus, but his grief was never hopeless because he knew what waited on the other side of the stone. The danger comes when a believer mourns exactly like someone with no relationship to God at all, shaking a fist at heaven and declaring that life has lost all meaning. Mourn fully, mourn honestly, but never mourn as though the resurrection were a lie. 2. Never consult mediums or attempt to contact the dead. This is perhaps the most spiritually dangerous item on this entire list, and tragically one of the most common, even among people who call themselves Christians. I think of a woman I heard about hollowed out by the loss of her husband, persuaded by a relative to seek out someone who claimed they could deliver one final message from the other side. She went out of desperation, not malice. She only wanted peace. But what she opened that day was not peace, it was a door. Deuteronomy 18:10-11 could not be clearer. Let no one be found among you who practices divination, interprets omens, engages in sorcery, or who is a medium or spiritist who consults the dead. This is not a gentle suggestion, it is a direct command, repeated throughout Scripture, because God knows precisely how exposed grief leaves the human heart. The moment a person dies, they stand in the presence of the Lord or are separated from Him. They are not lingering nearby, waiting to whisper through a stranger for a fee. Whatever answers in that room is never the one you lost. Take your sorrow to God in prayer. Never take it to a medium in a darkened room. 3. Never turn the funeral into a stage for performance instead of worship. This point is quieter than the others, but it is just as corrosive. There are moments at funerals when grief becomes theater, when mourners compete to be seen as the most devastated, when the loudest weeping is mistaken for the deepest love, and quiet faith is mistaken for indifference. Proverbs 14:30 tells us that a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. I have watched families turn a casket into a battlefield, arguing over who has the right to speak, who has the right to sit closest, who has suffered the most, all while the person they claim to be honoring lies forgotten in the middle of it. That is not grief, that is pride dressed in mourning clothes. A funeral is meant to be worship, a moment to reflect on how brief life truly is and to point every heart in that room toward Christ. The instant it becomes a contest for sympathy, it stops being sacred and becomes a performance for an audience that should never have existed. 4. Never bury unforgiveness alongside the body. This is one of the heaviest truths on this list and one of the most common, even among people who call themselves Christians. I think of families I have watched stand beside a casket undone by a sorrow that has no floor beneath it and no light above it. That is not sadness, that is despair, and despair has no place in a heart that belongs to Christ. This does not mean your tears are forbidden. Jesus himself wept at the tomb of Lazarus, but his grief was never hopeless because he knew what waited on the other side of the stone. The danger comes when a believer mourns exactly like someone with no relationship to God at all, shaking a fist at heaven and declaring that life has lost all meaning. Mourn fully, mourn honestly, but never mourn as though the resurrection were a lie. 4. Never place your hope in rituals, objects, or superstitions instead of Christ. Funerals across many cultures arrive wrapped in tradition, items placed inside a casket, candles arranged in careful patterns, customs meant to protect the spirit of the one who has died, and superstitions about what must or must not be done so they can rest properly. Colossians 2:8 warns us to see to it that no one takes us captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ. Many of these customs are not as neutral as they appear. They quietly teach that a soul's eternal rest depends on a ritual performed by the living rather than on the finished work of Jesus on the cross, and that is a dangerous substitution to make at the very moment your family needs truth the most. The destiny of a soul is sealed the instant they take their last breath, not by a candle, a chant, or an object laid beside them. You can honor culture and family without ever surrendering biblical truth. Do not let tradition quietly stand in for the gospel. 6. Never gossip about the deceased or their family during the gathering. This truth is uncomfortable, but it must be spoken. Funerals have tragically become one of the most common places for gossip to spread. Hallways and parking lots fill with whispered judgments. Did you hear how they really died? Did you know what really happened in that marriage? I always sensed something was wrong in that family. Proverbs 11:13 tells us that a gossip betrays a confidence, but a trustworthy person keeps a secret. James 1:26 adds that anyone who considers themselves religious and yet does not control their tongue deceives themselves, and their religion is worthless. I think of grieving widows overhearing words never meant for their ears, words that turn the worst day of their life into entertainment for someone else's idle mouth. That is not careless, that is cruel. A funeral is sacred ground, and the tongue that gossips at a graveside does not dishonor the family. It dishonors the God who hears every word spoken in that room. 7. Never leave a funeral without examining your own readiness before God. Of all 7 warnings, this may be the most important, because a funeral is one of the rare moments in life when eternity refuses to be ignored. And yet, so many walk out of that building exactly as they walked in, untouched, unchanged, unmoved. Ecclesiastes 7:2 finishes its thought by reminding us that death is the destiny of everyone, and the living should take this to heart. A funeral is never merely an event to be sat through out of obligation. It is a sacred appointment where heaven and earth stand nearer to one another than almost anywhere else on this side of glory. If you take this to heart today, your grief will be holier, your family will be more honored, and your walk with God will be far steadier the next time you stand at a graveside. If this message spoke to your life, share it with someone who needs to hear it before their next funeral. Subscribe to this channel to keep growing in biblical wisdom, and write in the comments, "I choose to guard my heart at every graveside, and I will let no tradition or temptation stand between my grief and my God."